Today we are going to discuss on a very important topic. This is the clinical anatomy of furnace failure. So if we look into blast furnaces from our past experiences of like 2 decades, we realize that blast furnace is less like a machine and more like a biological organism. When it fails, it does so through a specific diagnostic pathology. So today we are performing a clinical anatomy of these failures. If you look at the title graphic, you will see a blueprint style overlay of a furnace where the internal heat, the heart of the process, is fractured by icy blue crack of irregularities. By the end of this session, you will be able to first identify early telemetry signatures before a catastrophic event. Second is to distinguish between the contradictory interventions required for hot versus cold hanging. And third, the master the M profile gas distribution to purge wall accretion. Understanding these mechanics is not just about theory, it's about preventing a multi-million dollar freeze that could sideline your plant for months. To understand how we lose control, we must first define delicate balance of the ideal operational state. So coming to our next slide, which is on a operational stability. So look at the comparison on your screen. On the left title, the ideal state. You see a clean blue rectangle representing the furnace volume with a perfectly straight vertical blue arrow pointing up and uniform red arrow pointing down. This represents flawless counterflow. The gas rises uniformly, exchanging heat and oxygen with the burden descending at a steady, predictable rate. Now look at the reality on the right. The neat arrows are gone, replaced by chaotic swirling orange path that snake round massive dark grey obstructions. The level point to flow disruption, channeling, and the thermal imbalance. When this exchange is hindered, we see a system failure. And for a manager, the so what is simple. Every deviation from those straight line on the left result in higher fuel rates and erratic hot metal chemistry. If we cannot maintain this counter flow, the furnace effectively begin to suffocate itself. Because this failure is not uniform, we must map exactly where these pathologies occur within the furnace anatomy. So this slide provides a diagnostic map breaking the furnace into three critical zones. At the top in the yellow box, we have the upper shaft or the aerodynamic zone. Here we look for channeling and ore shift. Moving down to the orange box, we cover the shaft, belly and wash, the accretion zone. This is where wall parasites like scaffolds and scab restrict the working volume. Finally, the blue box at the bottom highlights the wash and hearth, our drainage zone. Pathologies here like chilled hearth, our cook mess are often terminal. As an engineer, you must realize that a problem in the upper shaft often mitigate downward, eventually choking the drainage zone. If you misdiagnose the drainage issues as an aerodynamic one, your intervention will be useless. You will start our deep dive at the top, focusing on the most common aerodynamic failure, the path of least resistance. As all of us know, that path of least resistance leads us directly to the phenomena of fluidization and channeling. Now, in the next slide, observe the channeling fluidization model. On the left of the slide, you see a cross section of Bodin where a central bright yellow plum of gas is violently forcing its way through the center, represented by upward pointing arrows. On the right, we see the ore shift cycle. Follow the circular arrows. High velocity gas lift fine ores which are then deposited in low permeability areas. This makes the permeable channel even narrower and the gas velocity even higher. It's a vicious cycle. From an operational standpoint, this is a disaster for the kinetics. The gas is not staying in contact with the ore long enough for efficient reduction. You will see your CO-CO2 ratio tank and your top temperature spikes because the heat is not being transferred to the body. This is not just a waste of energy. It's the it's a it's a sign to show a physical slip that can damage your top gear. To catch this cycle early, we have to look at the telemetry signature of active channeling. And for that, we can show this next slide, which shows that it is basically a representation of ECG for the furnace. So we have four key sensors shown here. Top left, the thermal array shows a sharp jagged orange line climbing. This is the rise in top gas temperature. Top right, the chemical sensor shows a blue line falling off a cliff, representing a sharp drop in CO2 content of the top gas. This happens because the gas is short circuiting and not reacting with the ore. Bottom left, look at the pressure differential. Those wild erratic pulsations are the furnace breathing irregularity and irregularly also. So finally, the stock line radar on the bottom right shows the burden surface collapsing into suspended layer. So when you see these four signature align, you are not just having a bad day, you are losing the aerodynamic stability of the stack. The so what here is immediate intervention. You must adjust your charging or blast parameter now, or the furnace will hang. Beyond gas flow, we must deal with physical growths on the wall, especially the distinction between scaffold and scab. So, I see many young engineers confuse these two, but their treatments are polar opposite. So, look at the table. Scaffold occur in the middle and upper shaft in lower temperature region. So they are solid impervious masses made of alkali metal, zinc and carbon indicated by blue crystal iron. Now look at the scabs. They form lower down in the belly and wash and are viscous semi-fluid masses of slag shown by orange lava icon. So notice the symptom. A scaffold causes a massive 100 to 200% increase in dust emission because the gas is squeezed into a smaller area. A scab, however, is often signaled by a sudden rise in flame temperature and reduced blast humidity. If you try to melt a scaffold with heat, you might just make the scab below it worse. Understanding the chemistry of this buildup is key to purging them. So, to understand how a scaffold becomes so resilient, we have to look at the self accelerating alkali zinc cycle. So, coming to the next slide about the self accelerating alkali zinc cycle. which create impervious wedges. So this is a chemical feedback loop. On the left, the diagram shows a cross section of brick wall with a large orange wedge labeled scaffold pursuing into the furnace. Follow the circular flow on the right. If you come across step 1, these volatile alkali metals like potassium and sodium along with zinc vaporize in the hot lower zone. Let us intervene the step 2, in which this vapor rise aggressively with the furnace gases. As far as step 3 is concerned, they hit the cooler upper brick and condense or reoxidize. And as far as step 4 is concerned, this deposition expand the brick volume, literally pushing the brick inward and creating a sticky film that catches descending burden. This wedge grows until it physically blocks the descent of the ore. This is not just a flow issue, it's a structural threat to the furnace lining. So if you don't control your alkali input at the center plant, the furnace will eventually build its own internal dam. So once we have identified this accretion, how do we get rid of them? So our next slide, which is about intervention for purging a scaffold and scabs. So we have two main toolkit, chemical and aerodynamic. Under chemical control, note the equation by adding stoichiometric amount of calcium chloride, we convert a sticky oxide into volatile chlorides that can be purged. We can also wash the wall with a firelight center to dissolve limy incrustations. On the aerodynamic side, we enforce an in-profile gas flow. Look at the icon of the tuyer. We are adjusting the bell throat to force gas along the periphery to physically eliminate these scaffolds off the wall. So the operational impact here is temporary loss in efficiency for a long-term gain in volume. So you might even temporarily reduce blast temperature to raise the slag fusion zone and melt those lower scabs. So it's a balancing act. Too much heat and you melt the scab, but too little and furnace hang. So speaking of hanging, let's look at what happens when burden stops moving entirely. So our next slide exactly directing towards these hanging when stock descent meets this terminal resistance. So hanging is the nightmare scenario where the downward force of gravity is equaled by the upward force of gas and physical obstruction. So this slide illustrates four causes. Callout 1 shows the physical obstruction of a scaffold acting as a literal ledges. Callout 2 is peripheral overloading where fine sores pack the edges too tightly. Callout 3 is liquid drainage blockage where viscous slag clogs the coke grid, and callout 4 is thermal freezing, resolidified slag cementing the wash. Look at the large red arrow pointing down being met by the powerful orange arrows pointing up. So when these forces balance, the burden hang in place. The so-called is a total stop of production and a massive buildup of pressure under in the hang. If that pressure let go all at once, you get a slip, and that one thing gets dangerous. But before we address the slip, we must recognize that not all hangs are created equal. So now the our next slide, which talks a lot about uh, this the slips. So this is the most critical slide for a shift manager. We have hot hanging on the left and cold hanging on the right. So for a hot hang, the cause is high flame temperature making the stock descent sluggish. The intervention is to lower the blast temperature. However, for a cold hang, the cause is viscous, solidified slag clogging the coke grid and often form a leaking cooling plate. The intervention here is to raise the blast temperature. So look at the warning at the bottom. Misdiagnosing the thermal state leads to opposite action intervention, so which will accelerate system failure. If you add heat to a hot hang, you will fuse the burden into solid mass. If you take heat away from a cold hang, you will freeze the heart. So you must check your slag chemistry and cooling water losses before you touch the blast temperature lever. So if a hang is not resolved, it inevitably leads to a violent event, the slip. And our next slide, particularly direct, basically on that direction. So a slip is a three-stage disaster. Panel 1 shows the arc where the burden is physically breezed across the furnace. In panel 2, the void forms underneath the arc as the material below continues to melt and drain, creating a high pressure pocket. Panel 3 uh, is the collapse uh, when the arc fails. So thousands of tons of material drop into that void instantly. This causes a massive ejection of unprepared coke dust and gas pressure surges that can blow out the top seal. Notice the impact, erratic metal quality, specifically low silicon and high sulfur because the material didn't have time to react. So when a slip is imminent, the warning is clear. Evacuate personnel. This is explosive physical damage that can take a furnace down for a days for repair. So while the slip happen at the top, its consequences are often felt at very bottom in the heart. So heart pathologies, drainage blockage and thermal collapse already I have shown. And if you take description, if you want that is as you have shown on the left of that slide that already I have shown, we see choking. The graphic shows thick, dark brown slag struggling to move through a grey coke particle. So this is caused by high slag viscosity or degraded coke. On the right is the chilled heart, the heart attack of the furnace. So notice the blue area at the bottom. The iron temperature is falling fast, represented by falling fast level. So a chilled hearth often happens after a massive sleep dump unsmelted. So cold material directly into hearth. So if the temperature drops below the liquidus point of 1150, the iron will solidify and so called is a total furnace freeze. So once that metal turns solid in the hearth, you are not an engineer anymore. You are a miner with a jackhammer, and that is a very expensive place to be. As the heart fail, the symptom manifests at the 2 year. So, uh, 2 year burning and the cook mess are our the slide which is directing towards this. So these are the terminal signs on the left. The 2 year burning shows a copper 2 year literally melting as molten iron flows radially outward because it cannot drain downward contact the copper. So you see the red 2 year failure imminent warning. On the right is a cook mess. This looked like a explosion in the raceway. So during casting, a massive amount of degraded unscreened coke are ejected alongside the slag and metal. This is caused by total mechanical or chemical breakdown of the coke grid. So when you see the coke maze, your coke window, the permeability of the hearth is gone. At this point, the furnace is no longer controlled reactor. It's a chaotic failing vessel. The cost here is not just in tear, but in the potential for catastrophic breakdown. So these events do not happen in isolation. They are the part of connected failure chain. So our next slide, which is on the cascade of the failure, that is the interconnectivity of the irregularities. So this flowchart is the most important big picture visual in the deck. It starts at the top with the fines uneven gas distribution, which leads to channeling. So from these you will see two paths, one leading to alkali zinc vapor ascent and scaffold formation, and the other to viscous slag and the scap formation. So both paths converge on the hanging. Hanging leads to arch void formation, which result in a massive slip. Finally, the slip trigger either a chilled hearth or two-year burning of the cock mess. So the lesson here is that an irregularity is not an isolated event. It's a symptom of a cascading failure of the counterflow environment. So if you can stop the channeling at the top, you prevent the chilled heart at the bottom. As engineer, we must intervene at the highest point of the cascade possible. To perform those interventions, we have four primary control levers. So we are coming to our next slide on the operator's control lever. So we close with our dashboard for a recovery. So first, burden preparation, you must screen out fines and ensure coke strength is above 20-25 mm to maintain that coke window. The second is the charging sequence. Use blank hook charges to clear the choking or alter sequence like CCCOO to control peripheral flow. The third is the blast parameter. Modulate your blast temperature accurately. Remember the problems that I have already mentioned. So it's a lower for the hot hanging and raise for the cold. So accordingly we have to do, otherwise it has got a different effect. So, and fourth, the slag chemistry. So maintain a fluid less viscous slag through controlled viscosity and avoiding raw limestone. So a furnace failure is rarely the result of one bad decision. It's the accumulation of ignored telemetry. So master this lever, watch your signatures, and you will keep your furnace and your plant stable.